All right, this will be a video about John Denver's insanely strange background. And if you've been following my channel for a while, you might know I've been doing these compilation videos of 5 celebrities who have just really bizarre backgrounds. They come from strange families, and in a lot of cases, they have just these really odd connections to major events in history. And I was going to do another one of these compilation videos, but there is just so much crazy stuff here with John Denver's life. So I figured I'd do a video just focused on him. So we'll get into it, and we're going to cover everything from John Denver's connection to the Space Shuttle Challenger that blew up in 1986. We'll talk a bit about his death in 1997, which has some very suspicious things going on. And we'll even cover John Denver's strange link to the movie Ghostbusters 2. So there is a lot of weird stuff going on with him. And first up, his name wasn't actually John Denver. His real name was Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. And his life starts out on a really interesting note because Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. was born in Roswell, New Mexico. He was born New Year's Eve, 1943, in Roswell. And his father, Henry Deutschendorf Sr., was an Air Force lieutenant colonel who was stationed at the Roswell Air Force Base. And he wasn't just some any old Air Force pilot. Henry Deutschendorf Sr. was one of the most decorated test pilots in all of the Air Force. And in 1961, John Denver's father, Henry Deutschendorf Sr., actually set 6 world speed records in an Air Force jet. He flew over 1,000 miles an hour. Here he is. He was the pilot of the flight. And obviously, Roswell is known as being the site of the very mysterious 1947 crash of whatever it was that crashed there that day. Some people claim it was a UFO from outer space. Some people claim it was some sort of experimental aircraft that the military was testing. If it was an experimental aircraft, you do have to think there's a pretty strong chance that John Denver's father could have been involved in the testing of this technology since he was one of the most decorated test pilots in the Air Force. Now, officially, at least, John Denver claimed his family moved from Roswell when he was 3 years old. So that would have been right before the crash. So officially, at least, his father wasn't stationed at Roswell when the crash happened. But if this was some type of experimental aircraft, he still could have been involved in testing of it while he was stationed at Roswell in the years before the crash. But anyway, after they moved from Roswell, they lived in a number of different Air Force bases throughout the nation. And after he graduated from high school, John Denver enrolled at Texas Tech University, stayed there for a few years, and then he abruptly dropped out and moved to Los Angeles in 1963, which means he moved to LA right as the whole counterculture movement was really kicking off and gaining steam. And I mention this book all the time, Weird Scenes in the Canyon by Dave McGowan. But in this book, he talks about how just a ton of people who were the sons and daughters of very high ranking military officers, they all moved to Los Angeles really right around this exact same time. They were all musical artists and they just converged on the city. They all got recording contracts, and in most cases, recording contracts from major, really huge labels. And all these sons and daughters of really high ranking military personnel just became the face of the counterculture movement. And in the book, Dave McGowan theorizes that what the military did was to basically install certain military connected people into this counterculture scene and then promoted them as the face of this movement to basically co opt the movement and make sure that it didn't get too out of control or bring attention to things that they didn't want exposed. So it was basically a way to secretly control this movement. And John Denver's story was pretty much identical to a lot of these other military connected artists who were arriving in LA right around this time. He was from a military family. He moved to LA very suddenly, and he became a part of this group, the Chad Mitchell Trio. And this was a folk band who was known for songs that were very politically focused, and they were already very popular when he joined. Supposedly, he beat out over 250 other people who'd auditioned to join the band. And he was in the band for a few years, and then he became a solo artist, and his solo career is what he's most well known for. And all throughout his solo career, he continued to be very politically involved. Quite possibly, he was the most politically active artist during his era. He was just always speaking out on issues and giving benefit concerts. He somewhat infamously went to Russia during the height of the Cold War multiple times. And in 1985, he went on an 11-city tour throughout the Soviet Union, and these were the first concerts in the Soviet Union by an American artist in over a decade. And I do honestly really wonder if there wasn't way, way more going on with all these visits that he was making to the Soviet Union, because again, the official story is that he was over there preaching peace and an end to the Cold War. But there's a long history of celebrities being used as spies during wars. There's actually a decent amount out there on the internet. about celebrities who were performing spying duties during World War II, because being an artist or a celebrity is really kind of like the perfect cover. They're just sent abroad under the cover of like performing or entertaining the troops or going on a humanitarian mission, which they are doing, but they're also given like information to pass on or some specific assignment to carry out. There's this guy, George Estabrooks, who was actually involved in projects exactly like this. He was considered by some to be the father of hypnotism, and he wrote an article in the 1970s talking about how the military used him to hypnotize people to secretly relay messages during World War II. And it's honestly really interesting how he just describes this whole operation and how it worked. So I'll go ahead and just read a couple short parts from this article that he wrote about what he was involved with during the war. And he starts out by saying how he was used by the military to hypnotize couriers during the war. So he says, one of the most fascinating but dangerous applications of hypnosis is its use in military intelligence. Communication in war is always a headache. Codes can be broken, a professional spy may or may not stay bought, your own man may have unquestionable loyalty, but his judgment is always open to question. The hypnotic courier, on the other hand, provides a unique solution. I was involved in preparing many subjects for this work during World War II. One successful case involved an Army Service Corps captain who we'll call George Smith. And he continues on and talks about how the process works. He says, I put him under deep hypnosis and gave him orally a vital message to be delivered directly on his arrival in Japan to a certain colonel. Let's say his name was Brown, of military intelligence. Outside of myself, Colonel Brown was the only person who could hypnotize Captain Smith. This is locking, quote unquote. I performed it by saying to the hypnotized captain, until further orders from me, only Colonel Brown and I can hypnotize you. We will use a signal phrase, the moon is clear. Whenever you hear this phrase from Brown or myself, you will pass instantly into deep hypnosis. When Captain Smith reawakened, he had no conscious memory of what happened in trance. All that he was aware of was that he must head for Tokyo to pick up a division report. On his arrival there, Smith reported to Brown, who hypnotized him with the signal phrase. Under hypnosis, Smith delivered my message and received one to bring back. Awakened, he was given the division report and returned home by jet. There, I hypnotized him once more with the signal phrase, and he spieled off Brown's answer that had been dutifully tucked away in his unconscious mind. The system is virtually foolproof. As exemplified by this case, the information was locked, quote unquote, in Smith's unconscious for retrieval by only the two people who knew the combination. The subject had no conscious memory of what happened, so could not spill the beans. So it is really interesting to read how this process works from a guy who was involved with it firsthand. And I do wonder if something like this could have been going on with John Denver. He obviously had the military connection with his dad. This was right during the heart of the Cold War when he traveled over there, and the Cold War was just nasty. And again, being a musician on a humanitarian mission was just the perfect cover. And he could have also been used to provide cover for another agent or spy. So, in other words, John Denver himself wasn't the one spying or gathering intel, but an agent or a military officer was inserted into his entourage to spy during these Soviet Union trips. And this was actually done with Elvis. The Treasury Department wrote this letter here on screen talking about how back in the 1970s, Elvis agreed to let an undercover agent travel with him on tour. And Elvis told anyone who asked that this person was a part of his band, but the agent was undercover the whole time and performing an investigation and using the tour with Elvis as his cover. And John Denver also went to other countries that were hostile towards the US, like China, so I definitely think that he could have been involved in something similar to what Elvis did, especially with John Denver's family connections with the military. Actually, I think a lot of these 1960s artists who had the military backgrounds and the military family connections, I think a lot of them could have been used by the military for things like that as well. And the next strange thing with John Denver has to do with the movie Ghostbusters 2. So, the basic plot of the movie is that there's this really creepy painting of this ancient emperor named Vigo the Carpathian, and the spirit of this emperor is trapped inside the painting. And this spirit that's inside of the painting possesses one of the workers at the museum and orders him to bring him a baby that he can possess and basically be reborn. And Dana from the first movie has a baby that this worker brings to Vigo, and they do this big ritual to possess the baby with the spirit, and it nearly works until the Ghostbusters save the day. So honestly, it's a pretty disturbing plot if you really take a closer look at it. But the connection to John Denver is that the actor who played this baby in Ghostbusters 2 is Henry Deutschendorf Jr., who's John Denver's nephew. So it's obviously pretty strange that the baby chosen to play this role just happens to be John Denver's nephew. But the really disturbing thing is that this actor, Henry Deutschendorf Jr., he was a twin, and him and his twin brother were the ones who played the baby. But this actor committed suicide back in 2017 at age 29. And it was said that he suffered from a severe case of schizophrenia. And the really curious thing here is that there's a lot of speculation that some cases of schizophrenia are actually a form of demonic possession, basically saying that these voices that some schizophrenics hear or these alternate personalities that some of them suffer from is in fact demonic possession. And there's this guy, Dr. Jerry Marzinski. He has a ton of interviews out there about his research into schizophrenia actually being a form of demonic possession. Now, obviously, the plot of Ghostbusters 2 has to do with possessing this baby with a demonic spirit. And then this actor goes on to develop a case of schizophrenia that was so severe that he committed suicide. It's really curious. It's obviously very, very sad. You do kind of have to wonder if maybe the rituals being performed in the movie could have been a little too effective and maybe actually worked. And another kind of random strange thing about John Denver is that he was nearly on the Space Shuttle Challenger that blew up in 1986. So, in addition to his activism for nature, he was also very involved with NASA over the years. He was on the board of governors for this National Space Society, which is some sort of nonprofit that advocates for space exploration. And he's just kind of randomly on the board with a bunch of scientists and former astronauts and engineers. And John Denver himself even said after the Challenger explosion that at one point he was going to be on the Challenger space shuttle. He has this quote here. He says, "I was told at one point that I was going to fly, and I have every reason to believe that initial civilian flight was going to be mine until the president picked someone else." And then after the explosion, there was a controversy for a while over whether NASA should continue to get funding for the space program. And John Denver showed up to the hearings and lobbied in front of Congress about funding for NASA. So again, it's just kind of random that John Denver, of all people, was the guy they sent to Washington to lobby on behalf of the space program. At this point, he was just kind of some singer who wasn't nearly as popular as he once was. And I do find it interesting that NASA was basically ran by German scientists imported from Nazi Germany. There was this Project Paperclip that brought just thousands of Nazi Germans to the US after the war, and a number of them were involved in the US space program. Deutschendorf is obviously a German last name as well, so there's that connection there also. And then John Denver also claimed that he was close to going on a Soviet mission to space in the 1980s as well, and he even had discussions with Soviet officials about this. And again, this was right during the heart of the Cold War, but they were going to make him pay $10 million dollars to go on this mission, and he didn't want to pay that, so he ended up not going. And most recently, John Denver's death was a bit of a mystery. So he died in a plane crash in 1997. He was the only person on the plane. The plane he was flying was an experimental craft called a Long EZ, which is a kit built plane, meaning that when you bought it, it came in a crate and you assembled it yourself. And he bought the plane secondhand, so it was assembled by somebody else. And he'd only bought it the day before he crashed it, so he'd only owned it for a day. And the official story given is that he was practicing taking off and landing with the flight, and he did that 3 times. And then on his fourth flight up, he had problems switching the fuel tanks because it had 2 fuel tanks and one of them had gone empty. And as he was fumbling around trying to switch over to the other fuel tank, the plane went into a nosedive and crashed into the ocean. And there's a lot of strange things surrounding this crash. This site here that I found is a really great site. It has a very extensive investigation into the crash. And the first thing that's interesting is that John Denver's body was basically annihilated in the crash. The only parts of him that survived was his right arm and part of the top of his skull, but none of the teeth were found, and almost all of his lower body was missing, but strangely, a pair of jockey shorts were found. And 8 of the witnesses to the crash also reported hearing a loud pop or bang right before the plane descended and crashed into the water. And this site also lists out the witnesses who were interviewed and what they saw and heard. And many of the reports are very contradictory. Some people describe the plane being 300 to 500 feet in the air and then descending rapidly. Others described the plane flying so low that it nearly clipped telephone poles. Some witnesses described brown smoke coming from the plane. A couple people thought it was a remote control device that had crashed. And there's also some questions about the toxicology report because this is an official document, but it lists John Denver as the name, which is obviously his stage name, not his legal name, which doesn't really make much sense that an official document wouldn't use someone's legal name. So some people have questioned whether this is a legit document or if it was a fake. And that toxicology report ended up becoming a very important document because the main question that was asked after the crash was whether John Denver was using drugs or alcohol before the crash because he'd been arrested for drunk driving twice shortly before this crash. But the toxicology report said that he was clean, but he wasn't even supposed to be flying that day because his pilot's license was suspended because of those drunk driving arrests. And another question that's always been asked about the crash is why he was even allowed to take his plane up that day if he didn't even have a pilot's license. And the location of the crash was interesting too. He crashed in Monterey, California, and Monterey was the location of the Monterey Music Festival in 1967. And this is regarded as one of the most important counterculture hippie music festivals that happened in the 1960s, right up there with Woodstock. So it's a little coincidental that he was an influential counterculture artist, and the location of the crash just happened to be the site of one of the biggest counterculture festivals of the time. So overall, John Denver definitely has a very strange background and a very strange story. Definitely up there with some of the stranger celebrity backgrounds of anyone that I've covered. I still think Olivia Newton-John probably has the strangest background of any celebrity I've learned about, but John Denver isn't far behind. And then lastly, just wanted to give a big shout out to the members here on YouTube and the supporters on Patreon. Thank you so very much for your support. Really truly means a lot, and I just greatly, greatly appreciate it. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you soon with another one.